Boa tarde, as we say in Portuguese. Good afternoon to you all. I'd like to start, first of all, to saying a big thank you to Natalie, Aline, and all the team that has been involved, working very hard to make this happen. We can see, we can feel around how much time, energy, care, and devotion they have really kind of used in the last month, devoted in the last month to make this conference. So I'm very pleased and grateful to be with you all here. I also think that I should introduce myself. I don't have a card as all the panelists and the keynote speaker. So I am Krika, that's my nickname, how everyone calls me, or Cristiane Fontes, that's my full name. I am a Brazilian journalist who has been working with climate and environmental issues for 25 years now. And curiously, I have to tell you that until very recently, not so much well connected or close connected with the NbS agenda. I was living in Oxford in the last 5 years, and last September I returned to Brazil to join WRI Brazil as the executive director. And then, because WRI has been working on this agenda for quite a while, bridging the gap on science, project design, public policy, and finance, I have been learning a lot about NbS in the last few months. And something that is going to be no news for you all who are experts on the subject is that in Brazil, we have many, many vulnerable municipalities to climate disaster, water stress, and many biodiversity loss, degradation, and much more. And only a few of them are really prepared with green infrastructure and climate resilience, as we could notice tragically with the climate disaster in Rio Grande do Sul very recently. So in Brazil, we have an NbS accelerator initiative that has been working with loads of local municipality and actually multi-level governance. And one of these municipalities, actually in the opposite of the south of Brazil, in the northeast, called Marangajé, at Ceará, has been recently selected by the Ministry of Cities to implement its project that was designed with our support. I hope this is the first of many. WRI also has been working in global projects such as the Seeds for Forests that some of you might know, and is kind of the first of its kind, really kind of combining the rural and the urban agenda. And I would say that because we are going to have Karina Pimenta from the Ministry of Environment as our keynote speaker, I should also mention a study that we launched last June in Belém, where the COP is going to take place, which is called the New Economy for the Amazon. It is a study that was led by WRI Brazil, but a study that involved over 70 researchers, and many of them from the Amazon region, and 2 indigenous anthropologists, was quite groundbreaking for the institution as a whole, and also for Brazil. Also, this study showcases that actually having a very fertile economy that's based on the sustainable use of our biodiversity, that values our ecosystem services, and also the local knowledge of traditional communities can be a catalyst for a new Brazilian economic model. And this goes quite in the opposite direction of what we have been hearing in the last decades by some of the decision makers in the country. So this comes together in a moment as a set of new policies are under development in Brazil. So Karina is going to be referring to some of them. And also, I think this is a moment in which Brazil is so much at the spotlight because of G20 and COP30 that I hope this new set of policies can be also inspirational that go beyond the next COP in the country, yes, because there is much work to be done. For instance, this study, the New Economy for the Amazon, as we know, there is so much for us really to move the current economy that's quite based on the destruction of the forest to this new pathway. There is so much to be done, not only by us, but many others, by the government, civil society, private sector, etc., that we are now transforming this in a cross-cutting initiative at the organization. I also would like to highlight the participation of amazing, fantastic indigenous female leader that's going to be joining remotely this panel discussion with us. And she is not going to be here to kind of demand more participation in the public debate. She's actually going to showcase and present to us a very innovative initiative that was created by indigenous leaders, is for indigenous communities, and is managed by an indigenous organization in Brazil that's called Podali Fund. And I think this is also shows that not only at the government, but also different sectors of Brazil are trying to go beyond what we have been doing in the last decade or so in terms of tackling the problems with the forest destruction and biodiversity laws, etc. Of course, there are many challenges. I could mention a few of them just now. We have a very anti-environment Congress at the moment at the country, a very powerful political force against environmental issues. We have now new problems such as the organized crime that is expanding its presence at the Amazon. So there is much to be done, but the idea of bringing these voices and these topics here is a way of embracing the motto of the conference, growing positive change. And it's also what I have been requesting to our panelists. We have also other amazing panelists that I will be presenting to you shortly, who have loads of expertise on the ground project with finance. They're also experimenting a lot of things, new things that we need to really shift the economies. So I think I should stop. I saw the sign there, and I would like to, otherwise I also start to discuss what we should be discussing during the panel. I would like to introduce you to Karina Pimenta. Karina Pimenta is the National Secretary for Bioeconomy of the Ministry of Environment. This is a new position within the Ministry of Environment. She was chosen, selected by the Minister Marina Silva, that some of you might know. And she is someone with vast experience in this topic, bioeconomy, many others. She has been working for the third sector, such as Conexus, a Brazilian NGO that's really devoted to shape the nature positive agenda. But also she has been working for philanthropy and for the private sector in the past. So with further delay, I would say that the floor and the screen are yours, Karina.
Thank you, Krika. Thank you to all. Very good to be with all of you remotely, but I hope I can share some of the ideas. I would love to be there with you discussing further in depth the paths that Brazil is choosing to reach bioeconomy policy that will develop this segment in the country and also inspire, hopefully, other countries to follow the path, especially on our concerns on biodiversity and sustainable use of forests alongside with bioeconomy. So first of all, I would like to thank you all for inviting me for this panel. I'm speaking to you from a side room on the G20 meeting that is taking place now in Manaus, in the heart of the Amazonia. And for us, it's very special that the G20 initiative on bioeconomy is discussing the sustainable use of biodiversity here in the Amazon and enabling also the different countries that know more or less about what the region of the Amazon means to have this discussion here and in-depth experience to enlighten the discussions of what are the principles of bioeconomy to reach consensus on that. So I was not able to be there with you, but I hope you understand that for us it's a very important moment to have this event here. I think I will address two areas in the development of bioeconomy. I wanted to share with you some of the highlights on the advancements we are having on discussing for the first time bioeconomy under the G20 group. And the other part that I wanted to share with you is our experience in developing public policy in Brazil to promote bioeconomy and creating a consensus alongside in a country with very different contexts and economic matrix and environmental issues. How we are building a national policy that enables Brazil to reach a transformational path on ecology, on bioeconomy, and further. So I'll start by saying that the discussions on bioeconomy have happened in different forums, as you all know, and they are very ground on the specifics of the countries. Working on the G20 with the 80% of the economy and also 80% of the greenhouse emissions means that the first time we are discussing how bioeconomy relates to two very important issues, how it relates to the biodiversity loss and to some of our two important issues and two of the three crises that we face. The biodiversity loss and the climate mitigation and adaptation policies. To enable this discussion to work, Brazil has put forward three principles to access for discussing principles that delineate what bioeconomy should be on a global understanding. And these are the sustainable use of biodiversity. The second one is how we work with science, technology, and development, and technological development under the rules and of economic and environmental concerns. And the third is that bioeconomy should relate to our sustainable development goals and be an inclusive strategy for development, especially on the countries, on developing countries. These are the three axes under which we are discussing. The first meeting was very interesting to see how science and technology cross-cut so many segments and how that relates to the use of biodiversity and the concerns that we have and the opportunities that we have ahead of our countries. Many ones are concerned with the revolution on biotechnology and the concerns with the extension of biomass. And also we are putting forward alongside with these two opportunities, the opportunity to finally have a policy that will look into the development of sustainable use of our forests and our ecosystems. And I say forests, but I refer also to all our marine and aquatic resources also. This biopositive economy should enable us to see a transformational path in many different segments, from agriculture, energy, forestry, aquaculture, fisheries, and cosmetics, chemicals. And we see all that happening in different dimensions. And the experience that we are having here in G20 is how we can put that together on one-page piece of paper that will highlight, will enable us to shape this bioeconomy. And for us in Brazil, it is very special that we are discussing this with all these countries, because not only we expect that this discussion will flourish and move beyond G20 to other forums, but also we expect that this, and we expect and we are doing that, actually, is to help us shape the national policies on promotion of bioeconomy. As we all know, Brazil is a very important country for biodiversity, one of the that holds most of the 20% of biodiversity. It is we have 6 biomes and three marine ecosystems. We have a very diverse areas and economic matrix that enable us to talk about different bioeconomies. Bioeconomies in plural, as I say here in Brazil, because in each context that we have different economic and environmental paths that we have to design and target as future trajectory and path for bioeconomy. Last week, no, 2 weeks ago, on the International Environmental Day, it was very special for her to have President Lula publishing the first document on public policy, on national public policy, which is the National Strategy on Bioeconomy. It is a decree developed by the Ministry of Environment, jointly with the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Industry, and also alongside with other 13 ministries in Brazil, which are very important to have a broad policy and a policy that will reach out to different segments of bioeconomy. And for us, this step forward is one in a trajectory. It's one in a long-term path, but it also signs very important things for us that I wanted to point out to you. First of all, we all have different understandings of bioeconomy, and there we were able to reach out a consensus of what bioeconomy would mean for the Brazilian development. Yeah, and it brings some innovations or some specifics of the country that I think it's important to highlight. For us, bioeconomy was not a choice of one industry over another. It was not a choice of a policy target or goal. It is a choice of an economic model alongside with environmental and conservation and restoration. For us, justice, ethics, and inclusion are an integral part of the concept. It doesn't make sense for Brazil to engage into developing an economic model that won't target our social inequalities and the regional inequalities that we have in the country. So that's a very important piece of how we are designing public policy in Brazil. Another important piece that connects to that makes the nexus between bioeconomy and biodiversity is that we are looking into the sustainable use of biodiversity, the regenerative and conservation practices that come alongside the different sectors that will be part of this economic segment. And for us, this is important because it looks into not only the use of biological resources, but it looks into the whole value chains, into the whole organization of the economic sectors. It clarifies it, and it brings along, not clarifies, but it stands for one of the most important commitments of our government, which is the deforestation zero. And it shows not only that we are committed to that, but also committed to introduce more regenerative practices, especially on degraded areas and other parts that we will ensure that we will have a biopositive economy being introduced, being developed by us. And the third part that I wanted to highlight for you from our perspective is that bioeconomy is always a conjunction of products, services, and knowledge and environment and biodiversity and biological resources. But for us, bioeconomy should also be a conjunction of traditional and scientific knowledge. So we emphasize that for a country like us that have many biomes, that have many populations living and preserving these areas, we should also be an integral part of the policy to reinforce the rights, but not only the rights, the economic models that will enable these populations to have advancement in their economic and social cultural rights. The traditional knowledge, which is also for Brazil a very important piece of our legislation on genetic resources and benefit sharing mechanisms that for some of you might know, Brazil is one of the most innovative countries. This is an integral part of our policy. And one of the areas that the Ministry of Environment, under our work, is more interesting in work in terms of creating policy that will incentivize this sustainable use, ensuring the rights and the distribution of benefits to the populations that are the target of the bioeconomies, especially in the regions like the Amazon and other forested areas and collective areas, being that the indigenous territories, being that conservation units or unrecognized collective territories, but that hold a very social and cultural wealth, and that should be also part of our policy. I will finish by saying that we are all wonder how bioeconomy will develop in Brazil. And I was here in the G20, we did a small exhibition of products of bioeconomy. Many people were impressed with the diversity of products being developed by startups, by community organizations, by companies in the different segments and things. And I was reflecting that from my previous work 5 years, 6 years ago, we would see only raw materials on the table, and now we are seeing aggregated value products being developed. And I think we are going far. We are developing more than we can see or show in numbers. And there are many studies in Brazil that are trying to capture the value of bioeconomy, and we're still lagging behind. Don't have a very structured model that I could show to you the numbers and the impacts that will happen. And we are just in the start. And I would say that because we all know, and I know you all expect that on COP30, we will see some of these examples of bioeconomy. And I'll say that I hope that we can share some of that in a year and a half from now, but only to say also that this is not an economy that we are doing for this milestone. It is a vision for Brazil for the next 20 years, 30 years that we have to develop. The Amazon region and other regions of the country need to develop economic models that looks into the forest, look into the people. And for us, I hope you will see in a year from now some of the steps ahead of this policy, but for sure, that's a commitment, a long-term commitment that you have to have. And I will end by saying that I hope I could share with you some of the ideas that we have here. And I think this is just a start. And I hope that this kind of forum that talks about nature-based solutions will inspire us further on the construction of these policies, and saying that the best policies that we are doing is because the civil society and the different parts of the society are participating in and bringing knowledge and evidence to this discussion. And I think this is an integral part of doing very good policy in Brazil and elsewhere. So thank you very much, and I hope I can share some of that with you.
Thank you so much, Karina. Do we have any questions in plural? Yes, over there.
Thank you so much, Karina, for this very interesting presentation. I had a question. The previous session, we discussed a bit different types of demands on biomass. So for instance, there's the question of biomass needs for bioenergy that are growing, also for bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. There's this idea that we need more biomass also for bioplastics. So my question is, when we're thinking about bioeconomy and in the leadership role that Brazil has within the G20, how are you, I'd be very curious to know how you're integrating the notion that there might be too many demands for bioenergy or for biomass, and how do we ensure that the bioeconomy is truly sustaining biodiversity rather than creating excessive demands for it? Thank you.
Okay, maybe two more.
Thank you very much. That was a really interesting talk. I was wondering if you could speak to how you see the bioeconomy tackling some of the significant contributors to the Brazilian economy, like the agricultural sector, and how you're going to use the bioeconomy to disincentivize the subsidies that are going towards that, and as a model for the global aspect of that. Thank you.
So we have these two questions, Karina. Over to you.
Thank you. Talking about, on G20, we are talking about the different segments and choices of countries in respect to the use of their choices of strategy to their economic sectors. There are different policies underway. Yeah, on bioenergy and food system, for example, choices we have discussed how these relationships, but also how that can, for example, in Brazil, into biofuels specifically as a country that have enables. Sorry, just 1 second. Can you hear me? So in the G20, we discussed a very broad spectrum of segments that may be part of bioeconomy and how that reflect on the sustainable production systems that comes along with these industries. And I think that's the point that we all want to make, is how can we combine productive systems that will be nature positive jointly with the growth of these economies. In terms of the position of Brazil on bioeconomy, agriculture, and biofuels, Brazil, different from other countries, has a history on producing biofuels. Part of these engines is developed through very high advanced science and technology applied to improve the biomass on areas, in concentrated areas. But of course, we are looking into how that will not relate to further deforestation, and how that can be done through the segments in terms of occupying degraded land, and that will not generate a conflict with other industries such as food production. As we all know, this is a very delicate discussion. The data in Brazil that we are looking into says that we can grow biomass production, biofuel production in these areas without increasing other areas. So the things that how we do that on policy, and that's one of the discussions that the strategy will design now under a development plan that will tackle different segments. So that pace is not done yet for the Brazilian part, but on the international sphere, what we are looking into is how these different models will look into biopositive, being that biodiversity positive, different sources of material, or ecosystem services.
Thank you. So I think we should move on. And I would like to say muito obrigada, Karina, por ter falado conosco aí da reunião do G20. Espero que tudo esteja indo muito bem. So I hope everything's going well there in Manaus with you all over there. Bye-bye. Thanks. The trailer of a film still to be released in Brazil and internationally called The Forest is a Garden That We Need to Cultivate.
Povos da floresta é uma realidade milenar. Só o negacionismo é que consegue sugerir que tinha uma floresta sem gente e chegaram os portugueses e botaram uma padaria lá dentro.
Está estabelecido hoje que os povos indígenas da Amazônia foram pioneiros num processo de domesticação de plantas, porque essas práticas de cultivo, elas criam essa biodiversidade, essa agrobiodiversidade que caracteriza a Amazônia hoje em dia e reflete o quê? Um conhecimento sofisticado da natureza, né? Não é um resultado acidental.
A floresta é um jardim que a gente cultiva. A floresta é uma coisa produzida por pássaros, primatas, gente, chuva. Se as comunidades humanas que estão lá dentro conhecem esse ecossistema e cuidam dele, ele vai viver, vai se reproduzir. Se você predar ele, ele vai mudar até uma hora que ele vai chegar e vai ficar inviável, né?
Vai acabar a nossa terra, a nossa floresta não vai ter daqui para o futuro. Sem a floresta, sem minhoca, a terra vai ficar seca. O povo mercadoria, eles roubaram terra grande, o Brasil é grande. Eles estão querendo nosso pedaço da terra. Eles falam que a terra Yanomami é muito grande, é pouco índio, mas pouco índio está protegendo tudo. Está protegendo a vida de vocês também.
O que tem a ver a vida da cidade com a vida dos indígenas, né? É uma luta ultrapassada, né? É uma luta primitiva? É uma luta para voltar ao passado? Não, não é. Mas se os direitos indígenas estão ameaçados, os territórios estão ameaçados, essa biodiversidade toda também está ameaçada.
Ei para Yamakan, Urihipa no Amonda, Shaari, Omaktemi Purupa, Uriteri Yamaku Kushualda, Omakiniatemi Batai.
So this film, as I said, is about to be launched. It's a film that was directed by a Brazilian filmmaker called Mari Correia, and she has been working with various indigenous communities in various films productions. And very recently, she launched in Brazil a Rede Catahirini, that's a network of female indigenous filmmakers. I can share afterwards the link of this initiative with any of you interested to know more about that. It's really fascinating. I would like now to invite our panelists to come here to the stage, and I will be introducing them all. I will be starting with Valeria Payet, who is joining us remotely. Valeria is an indigenous woman leader of the Chirió Kaxinawa people who live in the Pará and Amapá, and also which is Brazilian Amazon, and also Suriname. She is a social scientist who has been working for indigenous organization for many years and is now the executive director of Podali Fund, that we will learn more about in a few moments. I also would like to invite Joe Anderson. Joe describes himself as an ecologist by profession, as a conservationist at heart. He has been working and has very close connection with Africa, a place that he first visited when he was 18 years old. And he is currently the director of development of the Carbon Tanzania. Carbon Tanzania develops RED Plus projects to generate carbon credits to help finance conservation, but also income for local communities, including the Maasai people. So, Joe, come here. Thank you. And so together with Joe, Valeria is also Siddharth Shikatan. I'm not sure if I mispronounced your name, apologies. So he started his career at McKinsey, and then he moved on to work as a correspondent in Hong Kong for Financial Times. So we have more than a journalist here. Actually, we have a group of them in this panel with me, I just found out recently. He then co-founded a carbon removal startup, and also worked for some time as a consultant for the World Bank and for the Singapore government on environmental policies. Last year, he published, I don't know if his first book, but a book, The Case for Nature, pioneering solutions for the other planetary crisis. He is now the investment director of Just Climate. Please sit down. Oh, seat. Yeah, which would be easy for me. Yeah, thank you. Helen Avery. Helen is also a journalist in her previous life, or used to be in her previous life, and she used to work at that time as an editor for publications such as the Romani magazine. She now leads the Nature team of the Green Finance Institute, supporting the mobilization of private sector finance into nature restoration and the transition to an economy that invests into the natural environment. Welcome, Helen. And last but not least, we have here with us today in the panel Will Baldwin Cantelo. Will worked in Malawi with various communities on community forest management project and was a senior policy advisor in the UK government on international environment and development policy. Will is the Nature-Based Solutions Director at WWF UK, where he oversees Nature-Based Solutions Accelerator and the WWF role on the Trillion Trees joint venture with BirdLife and WCS to accelerate global progress on forest conservation and restoration. Please, Will. So, we have Valeria here. I will start with Valeria. Hello, Valeria. Boa tarde. Thanks for joining us. I would like to ask you a set of questions, and then you can pick and choose which ones you are able to respond in 7 minutes. What is the uniqueness and relevance of Podali Fund? What have been the funding priorities of the fund up to now? And I think it would be really good if we could learn from you also, considering the set of new policies that Brazil government is currently developing, how they should prioritize initiatives such as this, and how we also could stimulate contributions from investors and the private sector.
Aya, Kuremanadi, sauda todos que estão aí.
I would like to greet everyone that is there, everybody who is participating in this panel. Thank you all. And without further ado, I will try and answer the questions that were asked, which is a challenge to answer in 7 minutes, but I will try. I should mention the introduction of this panel, the video we just watched with 3 important indigenous leaders here from Brazil. And they are bringing important messages to this conference. Let's dive in. Krika, regarding the uniqueness of this project, in order to get here, I will share a little bit about how Podali was built. Podali Fund uses an indigenous name. It is from the Baniwa people who live around the Negro River in the state of Amazon and the frontier with Colombia and Venezuela. And this fund comes from a very long construction process, so to say, that had several different steps. And it considers our time, the indigenous time, in this process of construction. It is also the result of our wise men efforts, our leaders, such as the ones that you saw in the video that was just shown and that had Sônia Guajajara in it. This process was led by COIAB, which is the coordination of the indigenous peoples of the Brazilian Amazon, a very important organization that leads this type of process here in the Brazilian Amazon. Very well. This victory of the Podali Fund for us consolidates several steps that led us to advance our rights, our right to self-determination, self-management, food systems, and all other processes. Just to remind you, up to 88, indigenous peoples of Brazil couldn't even organize themselves. We didn't have a voice. So it is fairly recent, this process of occupation and having a voice in this type of process. So 30 odd years showed that this walk took place with this experience, and this is something that confirms that the indigenous peoples are in a process of conquering their space through dialogue and building together. So the Podali Fund is an indigenous fund that was thought and created by and for indigenous peoples and is managed by indigenous peoples. I am the executive manager for the Carioca people, and I come from an indigenous land in Brazil. The experience is part of this net of the indigenous movement. We are part of our communities. We know our realities. We live these realities on the day to day. So, Podali is based on the ways, on the manners that we work together and do things for each other. The relevance of the challenge, or rather, the relevance of Podali is a challenge that is very much present in the way we work. This challenge is to balance the bureaucratic demands of our supporters, financiers, investors, with our own ways to socially organize and manage our affairs. Considering, of course, transparency, correct management, and other factors. Some of the processes are conducted taking into consideration that this is something that should be shared with those who are concerned about respecting our ways. This different way of organizing socially is important in the way we manage. This has to be a learning curve, a walk together, because we have the challenge of following the path without repeating a colonization process. The process of those who invest tell us what to do. No, we don't agree with that. We have to build the way together. The main financing priorities were brought by Karina. One of the important themes for us is the guarantee of our rights, the guarantee of our territories through demarcation, protection, eviction of illegal miners, a valuing of the indigenous economy, the protagonism of women and our youth, and the care for our brothers who are voluntarily isolated. These are some of the priorities, and there are many others. They are all interconnected. We cannot treat these themes isolatedly. On the other hand, I reinforce that the guarantee of our recognized rights based on this path we took in the past few decades and the protagonism of our leadership are cross-sectional themes, and they are very important in this process of ensuring our rights and the care that has to be made in all senses of this fund. Now, getting to the end, how can the private sector be a part of this process? I believe that, first of all, based on our experience, it is important to recognize, respect, and engage in fulfilling our rights. That is the base for everything. This is the base for everything else to happen. That entails the maintenance of our land, care for the culture, language, and the self-determination of indigenous peoples. Second point would be Podali is an instrument that indigenous peoples from the Brazilian Amazon have built in order to build a dialogue between us, indigenous peoples, and society and all its institutions. In order to support Podali, we need to carry on in this process. We have our way of organizing, as I said, we have our governance levels, and through this dialogue, we include all this diversity. So to be with us, those who want to be a part of it are also brave, engaged, and could adapt to our management ways so that we can include indigenous peoples and the way that they organize themselves. We need to be bold. We need to run risks together because not everything that we do, and this is not just for indigenous peoples, not everything we do will work. Some things might go wrong, but we need to be together in this path. In everything we do right and also in the obstacles in the way. It is also possible to support specific projects or specific themes such as women, entrepreneurship, economy, care for the land, monitoring. These are a number of priorities that we can work on together. And just to conclude, I'd like to say that while discussing such an important theme on nature-based solutions, the Podali Fund is a small seed that has been planted, is being looked after, and is an opportunity to help face the greatest challenges related to the environment and society, and including, of course, the indigenous theme in Brazil and in the Brazilian Amazon. So I'd like to finish. Napofa, thank you.
Thank you very much, Valeria. So now over to you, Joe. I'd like to hear from you. How best should we address the current challenges in media scrutiny faced by forest carbon projects, and how to ensure that these projects do value and don't affect traditional lifestyles, as was mentioned by Valeria? Thank you very much.
Is that working? Yep. Yes, thanks so much, Krika, for having me on the panel, and thanks to the organisers. So I'm here essentially to represent the carbon development sort of sector, I would say. I'm representing Carbon Tanzania, which is a Tanzania-based RED project developer. So that's basically premised on just protecting forests. But we set up Carbon Tanzania as a conservation organization. That's our motivation. And I think we, myself and my co-founder, Mark Baker, we're ecologists, we're biologists, and we love being in the bush. You know, I'd be out watching birds if I wasn't, you know, sitting on this panel. So I think, you know, we definitely come from the same, the why we're doing this is shared with everybody, hopefully in this room, and, you know, everyone globally who's interested in, you know, making sure we protect nature. So, you know, I think the first question there is about the media scrutiny. How are we going to answer some of the questions that are being asked of the sector? And we're talking mostly here about the forest carbon sector, let's say. I think, you know, it falls into three broad units. The first is, you know, can we address the concerns around the actual accuracy of the carbon claims made by projects? That's obviously the first thing. And that's about estimation and modeling and all the sort of science that goes into that. The second thing that we have to answer is the question that the second question that was asked, which is, you know, what's the effect on indigenous and local communities? Can we make sure that it's any efforts that are put in any of these businesses, any of these carbon projects, are not negatively affecting livelihoods and rights? And the third, of course, is how do we ensure that the use of carbon offsets, which is essentially what we're talking about, is genuinely leading to decarbonisation and genuinely leading, of course, to emission reductions globally? Is offsetting credibly going to be a part of that? So, you know, I'm going to talk to the first two there. I'm not going to speak about the last one. You know, that's really a market and corporate claims end. I'm speaking from the project developer perspective. You know, there are bodies set up like the ICVCM that are dealing with the claims end. So I'm going to concentrate on the first two. The first one around being better at accurately estimating what these projects do in terms of reducing emissions. I mean, you know, in the most simplistic way, we need to just get better at modeling. We need to get better at setting baselines. And there are lots of efforts going in place right now to do that. You know, methodologies are being improved. There are big efforts around that. And, you know, we are all in this to win. You know, I think anyone you speak to wants to get better at doing this. We heard from Unai yesterday, and he told us that GDP, of course, as we all know, is a very coarse measure of the economy, but we can measure it. Carbon is a very simplistic measure of ecosystem health or value, let's call it, but we can measure it, but we can do it better. You know, so it's not capturing everything, but it is one way to measure it, and for now, it is the way to finance some of this important work. The second thing is we do have to eliminate, of course, conflicts of interest, which have been highlighted in the media, you know, quite rightly. And so that has to be sort of part of the evolution of the system, and that's about accountability and auditory oversight. And of course, lastly, we have to get better at dealing with, you know, the indigenous land rights issue, as is the second part of the question there. And to that question. Again, you know, the sector we're in, there's certainly far from perfection, of course, but I think, you know, we've heard a lot about the need for indigenous participation in these projects, and from my point of view, this has always been a cornerstone of how Carbon Tanzania has worked. We, you know, our design principles were very much dealing with the rights holders, the land tenure holders of the areas that we were hoping to conserve and partner in the conservation of. So land rights, it's been said several times, but I'll say it again. I absolutely believe that clear and unalienable land rights are a massive part of making this the best possible, you know, sector. That means making sure that you are entering into an equitable situation, equitable arrangement with the rights holders, with the land owners. And Carbon Tanzania, we work with all sorts of levels of jurisdiction, actually. We work with communities at village level who own forests through village land certificates. We work with wildlife management areas. They own rights to their forests through different mechanisms. And we work with sort of local and district governments as well, who have rights over their forests. So, you know, land rights, again, I can't say it strongly enough. And the second thing, we've heard it before as well, is this alignment with cultural values and the land use practices of people. Many indigenous groups, many local communities have a pretty good idea about how to manage their environment, it turns out. You know, they don't need to be taught how to protect their environment. What they do need, however, is governance structures and often funding to make those things real and to put in place mechanisms to better manage the resources in question. So, you know, those are the what we would call our pillars of our projects, you know, the land rights, the governance, and the agency over the process of management, and also the process of using the finances that are going to be a result of entering into a carbon project. And if you can get all those right, I strongly believe, and I believe we've shown it largely to be true, you have an extremely powerful mechanism for funding locally led nature stewardship, and linking those efforts and the services that are being provided by those communities to the global community, to the global economic system. So I think I'll stop there and pass on to the next person. Thank you very much.
Hello, is it working? Yeah. So, Sid, one of the key challenges that I didn't mention, but Joe just mentioned right now, is precisely funding, yes? Even for this set of new policies under development in Brazil, or for the Podali fund developed by indigenous people. So I will be on purpose over-optimistic here in my question to you. So how to create a surge of private finance into NbS initiatives in the next coming years? And in your opinion, which solutions should be best placed or left for the public budget of key countries? Yes.
Yeah, perfect. So I wear a few hats, a bit like Joe. So I started off as a biologist here at Oxford, have kind of lived in lots of different places and approached this problem from different lenses. But the one I'm adopting today is my day job at Just Climate, which is finding ways to move institutional capital into some of the highest impact climate and nature solutions. So I'll start there, but we can broaden out towards the end. Let me start just with a couple of reflections, quick, if that's okay, on the day that we've just had, which has been brilliant. I love the diversity of voices we've heard today. There was something earlier about pricing and commodifying nature. I think where I've landed on this is we currently price and commodify nature across the world, right? Like all of the destruction that we see is driven by something that is being valued in those natural ecosystems. Typically, it's productive potential for agriculture or something else. So in some ways, there's a really important conversation to be had about our sense of interconnectedness with nature, the kind of intrinsic spiritual, cultural value of nature that can never be captured by the financial system. I think it's immense. Justin's organizing a day tomorrow, which centers on those questions. I think it's super important. But I also think it's okay at the same time to hold that alongside the fact that the commodification of nature ship has sailed a very long time ago, hundreds of years ago, and what we see now is the direct result of that. So we might as well start weaving in other forms of value into a system that's currently driving a huge amount of destruction. So that's kind of why I think there is a role for private finance. But the next point I want to make is policy is incredibly important. It is. I love what we heard from both of you about land tenure and securing land tenure. Markets can't function without clear land tenure, and that may be land tenure for indigenous peoples. It might be land tenure for smallholder farmers in industrial agricultural systems. But without that, it's really hard to see how private finance can flow. And so that's one example where policy is important. Markets don't spring up from nowhere. They're heavily regulated by regulators, typically public agencies. It's why we have large markets in other segments, and we don't really have large markets for nature yet because of a lack of regulation and a lack of enforcement of existing regulation. The other piece is a lot of destruction is driven by other forms of environmental crimes which intersect with other forms of crimes more generally, right? So I think we need to look at all of those as areas where governments can really, really help outside of public funding. But then we can come back to public funding and say, oh my gosh, most of the money flowing into nature is actually public money. So the number we saw earlier, which Stephanie put up, I think it's really interesting to see how funding for NbS has gone up over the last couple of years. But the report, actually, if you dig into the numbers, the vast majority of that increase has been public subsidies in the wake of COVID. There's no massive surge of private finance into nature. That's an illusion, right? It's still about 18% as of the last SFN report. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny portion of something that is, I think, a quarter of the funding we actually need to get to nature positive. So there's a huge amount of room to grow. So we should just be really, as an investor, the first thing I try and do is be incredibly humble about what we can do and what is currently happening. Sometimes investors are framed as really powerful and really able to influence global supply chains and ecosystems. That is true, but most of those investors are investing in other things, driving nature loss and so on. There's not a huge amount of private finance for nature protection and restoration directly. So it's just really important to keep that in mind. Having said that, I think there is a role for commercial capital in nature-based solutions. And we can talk a little bit about that and what we've learned trying to look at this space from different angles. But the first thing to remember is when you think about investors, it's really important to remember that they're not all the same. There's many different types of investors. There's many different types of capital. And even though ultimately it's all money, some of that money is governed by a set of rules that they look very different to the money that philanthropic institutions or family offices or dedicated impact investment funds that can take concessionary returns are governed by. So most of the institutional money in the world sits within pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, university endowments, and insurers. It's your money. And as a society, we've set rules that govern how that money can be used. Not spent, but invested for an economic return. Right now, there's a really important conversation to be had about how those rules can change over time. But the way things stand, individual pension funds, for example, make decisions about where they allocate capital, but they are bound by a duty to seek the highest financial return alongside other goals. And different countries take different views on whether those other goals can be equally weighted alongside financial return. We've seen early movers and really thoughtful institutional investors. But fundamentally, those rules were set by the collective, right? Hopefully by some kind of process of democratic consent. But that's where we are. And so it's really important to recognize that institutional investors have constraints of their own, and they then impose those constraints onto asset managers. So people are actually making investment decisions in projects, in companies, in the landscapes that we care about and love. And so then what we've tried to do at Just Climate is look at that pool of money, which is enormous. It's hundreds of billions of dollars that could be unlocked for climate and nature investments, and say what could be a good fit for this type of capital. And I think it's also important to remember there that something that's marginally more profitable than business as usual, but that offers a huge amount of risk and uncertainty, ultimately doesn't move the needle for investors who are tightly constrained by the rules I've just described. And Helen very kindly lent me her glasses because I really need to fix my eyesight. But it's honestly a really helpful metaphor because as an investor, you can borrow someone else's lens onto the world. So Helen might believe that voluntary carbon markets are amazing and are going to go to $100 billion. I tried her glasses on; they don't really work, right? And so that's the other thing. You have to come up with your own views on these things. And we try our best and we do our research, and we're a science-led organization. We take research incredibly seriously. But ultimately, you're making educated hypotheses. You're not able to predict the future with a crystal ball. And so risk is something you have to manage at every stage of the investment process. And where you end up then is some markets remain hard to invest in as a private investor. And that includes any of the voluntary markets around nature that we're talking about. That's not to say there aren't good investments in those spaces. But as a whole, if you look at the State of Finance for Nature report, 200 billion, 80% of that is public money. Most of the private money is going into mandatory biodiversity offset schemes and a couple of other things that are essentially regulated by governments, so quasi-public money. And then you have $1 or $2 billion flowing into voluntary markets around corporate commitments. But what we have found is there is a huge opportunity in something else, which is actually land. Well, it's actually the same thing in my view, but you can frame it differently and call it land use transition. And really how you enable the transition of land use from what we see now to a future that supports the bioeconomy, respects indigenous and local people's land tenure, creates food security for a world that's growing very quickly. I'm being told to stop. Give me 30 seconds. I'll be really quick. And so things all across supply chains are really interesting, across agricultural supply chains that drive destruction and can transition to produce food that's healthy and safe for people and safe for nature as well. So I think that's really important. There's also a huge amount of work being done on restoration models that can restore degraded land. We heard about the Sahara restoration opportunity. Things like that can actually be really interesting economic models where you can produce food and restore nature. I'm just going to end by saying it's kind of emblematic that as investors, there aren't many in the room here because fundamentally this remains early in the investment landscape. That doesn't mean I don't personally believe it's going to grow. I'm a huge believer that there is very strong case for nature. There's huge opportunities for private capital to flow into the space. But we have a lot of convincing to do, and we're going to have to work together on that. Thank you. I'm coming back.
So, Helen, can you hear me? Yeah? It's working? Yeah. So, Sid mentioned regulation. That's precisely my first question to you. What is the role of regulation on social, environment, and climate-related risk disclosures to mobilize finance for nature in the next coming years? And also, what we can learn from initiatives such as the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures and from others that you have been working on recently?
So a bit of a tough remit at 4:30 in a very warm room to talk about risk disclosures and regulation, but I'm going to give it a go and try and make it interesting because it's just so important. I never imagined I would have a job that was spent a large part of my life talking about risk disclosures, but there it is, because it's just so important when I think it comes to nature. Obviously, of what the old adage of you manage what you measure, and the challenge is that we haven't measured our impacts on nature, the location of where our supply chains are and what the ecosystems, the health of those ecosystems, what our dependencies are. So it's very obvious stuff, but we haven't done that. Now we've started to do it in climate. We haven't really started to do it in nature. So for example, we worked with the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford, University of Reading, UWSMC, NISA, to look at the analysis for the UK and actually try and figure out what is that material risk of nature degradation to the UK, both imported, which is about 50% of imported risk, and then here in the UK, through chronic degradation, but also like those acute risks that we might start seeing. And it's huge. It was like just 3% alone is we're losing off GDP now. Because of chronic day-to-day soil health decline, biodiversity loss. Then when you add in acute shocks, that bumps up to 6%. When you add in climate, it jumps to 8%. So it shows you that actually nature is massive. Like nature degradation has an impact on our economy in terms of risk. We're sitting on a systemic risk that we don't know really much about. And I'll say this about this piece of analysis, like the group tried to do like the best they could with the data that was there to figure out what the impact might be and also get a sense of financial stability impact. We looked at the central bank's portfolio. Bank of England worked with us on that. It was public data. 52% of those assets, we had no idea where they are. Like straight away, 52% that whole portfolio we looked at. 20% additionally was in bonds. Again, we have no idea where those assets are, and therefore we can't assess that risk. So we're sitting on just a huge amount of risk. We host the UK National Consultation Group for the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. And, we talk to companies all the time, 600 companies in that group. And we say to them, are you going to start reporting on the framework? It's an incredible framework that sort of helps you walk through your location, then evaluate what your ecosystem services are and what your impacts and dependencies are and assess the level of risk. And they say, well, yeah, but we don't know where we source our strawberries. And you think, my God, it's just like basic business resilience. How can you not know where you're getting your strawberries? And yet this is what companies are facing. They actually don't know where they're sourcing anything. So just imagine the type of risk we're sitting on as a system. So they're just so important that we actually start disclosing and getting companies to disclose. So that's kind of like, why is it important? Then it's like, why should we regulate it? Why do we need to mandate it? And if you look at the TCFD in its final report before it got sunsetted into the ISSB, only 4% of companies that were disclosing on TCFD disclosed on the 11 disclosures, just 4%. Why? Because it was voluntary. About 42%, I think, were disclosing on less than 5 of the 11 disclosures. If it's a voluntary system, companies will do the minimal and they will not report. It's not because they're evil. It's just because they've got boards and they've got resources that they've got to manage, and they're just going to do what their shareholders want them to do and what they can, physically, get away with, or what's brought into business resilience. It depends. If your company is very dependent on supply chains, you might up it to more disclosures, of course. So we have to really think about mandating, regulating these disclosures, so we actually start to understand how are we basically screwing up nature. And what is the risk of us screwing up nature, so that we can start to shift. The reason we did that piece of analysis and we worked with all those amazing partners wasn't to sort of say, oh, isn't this amazing? We don't know that we're screwing up nature. It was to try and prove to companies and to our central bank that we should be integrating nature-related risk into climate risk, because ultimately we want money to move. So my final point, I think it's like, okay, we have this theory of change that you start reporting on your nature-related impacts and dependencies, and all of a sudden money will start to flow. And that's how we'll mobilize money. That's how we transition our economy to one that values and invests in nature. And I don't think that is the case necessarily, because what happens is we go to companies and we say, right, are you going to disclose? And they're like, oh, we don't really want to disclose because it's pretty bad. And then we're going to have to sort of declare to our shareholders that we don't know where our strawberries are coming from. And they said, but if we knew what to then do, at least we could then go out and say, okay, so we know that we've now got to do X, Y, Z with our farmers, for example, or if it's a rubber supply chain. I know David's in the room from Reckitt. They've already looked at what they're doing in their supply chain. Then they can actually start to move forward. So they kind of want that comfort of what WWF actually has been looking at for the UK. We've been doing some work with them on nature positive pathways, either by sector or actually probably by system, because, biodiversity, as we all hear all the time, is very complex, and it impacts multiple companies over one area of land. So we really need these nature positive pathways to then start moving us forward. And that's when I think you'll start to see the money flowing. At the moment, just saying disclose, I don't think we're going to see that flow. So that's kind of what we're hoping to move towards. But unless, I say, there's some regulation that needs to come in there. And I think markets is, this is sort of the bigger transition over decades, and then there's a different conversation around how we need to regulate for money going out the door now, and that's in the realm of markets and why we need more compliance markets. But I'll leave it there.
So, Will, I'd love to learn more about the main achievements of WWF initiatives, such as the Climate Solutions Partnership, NbS Accelerator, and also the Trillion Trees project. And also hear from you, how can NbS project developers manage upwards the integrity of demand from markets and financiers?
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Just before I answer your question, I just want to say two things. One, to the organisers, thanks for creating a space in which we can think so freely and speak so openly, and for having that day tomorrow to dedicate to thinking a bit more radically about how we change the way things are, which allows us to have the space today to say, well, how do we work within what we have? And the second thing, to you all, yesterday, most of you got very aggro about getting to your drinks and dinner at this point. So to keep you with us, or me, because I'm the last speaker on the last panel of the day, I've got a joke for you. So I asked ChatGPT to tell me a joke about nature-based solutions. I'm going to tell you half now and half at the end to keep you interested. So the first part: why did the river join the campaign for nature-based solutions? So you can tell me at the end whether it's worth the wait. Anyway, to your question, thank you. The way we look at the problem, and we've kind of hinted at this, is so we have, at the moment, $700 trillion going every year to nature harmful activities, and we only have $200 billion going to nature protective, conservation, restoration activities. And so there's a huge imbalance that we need to turn around. And as Sid was saying, most of that is public, a small amount is private, and that's often from compliance markets. So we have a huge job to grow that share. And that's where our work on nature-based solutions is kind of focused. But that's not to say that every nature-based solution should be aiming for private finance. And in fact, there are many that aren't. But the more that can access private finance should, so that public finance can go further. Anyway, so that guides our strategy and where we come in with our Nature-Based Solutions Accelerator, which is part of our broader Climate Solutions Partnership with HSBC and WRI, as well as Trillion Trees, as you alluded to at the start, is our joint venture with Wildlife Conservation Society and BirdLife International. all of whom are in this room somewhere. So, hello. So a couple of years ago, we looked at this problem. We said, well, what are the barriers to more private finance flowing to nature-based solutions from the finance sector's perspective? We asked them, what are the barriers as you see them? And the three top ones that came up, one was the information on returns and impact from those investment prospects. Second was the capacity of the finance sector to understand those opportunities, and without that capacity, the risk levels were perceived to be higher. And the third was just the quality and quantity of supply. So we set about trying to respond to those things. Obviously, it takes more than just us to respond, but we wanted to contribute to that response. And so on the first one, on that information on returns and impacts, our colleagues in WRI, Gabby, if you're here, raise your hand, wave it around, has done some great work with the Land and Carbon Lab to make more data available and usable to projects. We also, as Emily McKenzie yesterday referred to, have recently just published a document which enables nature-based solution projects and developers to communicate their impacts and their reporting in the language and the framework of TNFD, so that they're better able to communicate what they're seeking to achieve in the language that's going to resonate with companies and financial institutions. And in a moment, I think we'll flash up a QR code where you can go and find that. And I really encourage you to look into that and see if that's useful. It's something that we're putting out there for those in this community to use. The second thing on supply, which is where a large part of our work has been, we in the Nature-Based Solutions Accelerator set about a competitive process to identify some projects that we could add value to that would support them on their journey towards investment readiness. And we are now working with 6 of those, and they range from everything from regenerative cattle ranching in Peru with WWF Peru. Melissa, if you're here, give us a wave. And mangrove restoration in Kenya with the likes of Linda, and I see Irina here as well. And that process really highlighted for us a couple of things. One, the diversity of nature-based solution projects and developers around the world, and the different ecosystems and the different revenue streams that could be looked at, but also the financial literacy gap that we have within the community who are largely developing these, and the need for that kind of technical assistance and space and money to work up those financial cases. And in fact, most of us in this room are guilty of this. If you work in conservation, we often only cost 3 or 4 or 5 years ahead, but really we should be costing 20, 30 years ahead to be able to make a sustainable project. So those are the kind of gaps. But the criteria we used in that process were really clear around, is this project an NbS by the IUCN definition, and can it abide by those principles? Can it meet the environmental and social safeguards framework that we at WWF apply? And can it realistically be bankable within 2 years? And so we're in that process, and we hope that we'll have those projects at that investment ready point within the next 6 to 9 months, and it will be for them to go and access that finance that they need. The second supply intervention we're making, and some of you might have seen this presentation in the lunchtime gap, is the forest restoration catalyst through Trillion Trees, which is trying to be a preparation facility for landscape level forest restoration activities. And again, saying, what is the vision, the shared vision in this landscape of how forests can and should be restored, and why? And how much will that cost? How could that be financed from domestic, international, private, public finance, and to support the readiness for that and the enabling environment for that to happen? And we're piloting at the moment in the Atlantic Forest with WWF and in Sumatra with WCS, and we hope that that'll be something we can take to East Africa next as well. So just thirdly, then on the finance capacity, or the capacity in the finance sector on nature, and I as you mentioned, Sid, there are probably limited actors here from the financial institutions, but if you were here, I'd love to hear, in the conversation we're going to have, your perspective on this. But certainly where climate change capacity is growing, partly driven by disclosure needs, the nature capacity, the nature understanding in financial institutions is still way behind. And we haven't yet kind of taken a bold step into that space, but we've been working on how you integrate nature into transition plans with colleagues on that, but also looking to leverage the learning we've gained through the accelerator into the finance sector, and thereby try and contribute to that, to building that capacity gap. So there's a body of work there that, again, if we flash the slide up later in the session, you'll be able to go and have a look and see, including many posters out in the corridor. So come and talk to us if you'd like to learn more, including a forthcoming report with our colleagues in Oxford on nature-based solution insetting as well. Now, having said all that, you're probably all wondering what the answer to the question I posed at the start was. So why did the river join the campaign for nature-based solutions? Do we have a drum roll sound effect? No. Because it wanted to go with the flow of positive change. And I note positive change, this is complete coincidence, but unless ChatGPT's been listening to everything we've said, positive change is the kind of catchphrase for the few days. So thanks very much. Look forward to the conversation.
Thanks also for the joke and the ChatGPT participation here. So now we are going to open for questions from the audience here, and I think over there.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentations. My name is Christian Nielsen. I'm with the Live and Learn Network in the Pacific. I just wanted to reflect on carbon projects, and Live and Learn currently has 5 carbon projects in Solomon Islands, Vanuatu and Fiji. They've been running for 10 years. And I'm in support of the gentleman talking about the carbon projects in Tanzania, because I often think we hear a lot of bad things about carbon projects. And not all carbon credits are born equally. And there's a lot of really good carbon projects around the world. Now, one of the things, sort of reflecting on what we have learned in this space, in order to succeed, the carbon projects, they need to be led by Indigenous people. So they need to be involved with the project development, certification, verification processes. They need to be involved with monitoring and auditing processes. And within the Indigenous leadership group, women are by far the most effective to manage and lead such carbon projects according to our experiences. Another thing is the tension that we have found in the Pacific often comes from the issue around permanency. And a lot of countries, they would require legal protection in order for an area to be designated for a carbon project. And that is where the tension with Indigenous land rights often emerges. So we need to pay a lot more attention as within the carbon sector that Indigenous communities, they already have their own protective measures for the environment, and how can we incorporate that into the certification and verification process. And I want to give a plug to Plan Vivo, who we work with in the Pacific. They're terrific. They are on top of a lot of these issues that we're dealing with on the ground every day. Plan Vivo came to the Pacific. They came and did a tour to our projects, and they're working tirelessly in order to put Indigenous leadership at the center of carbon, the carbon sector. So yeah, thank you very much. Just a few reflections. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Christoph Warwick from Woodland Savers. We are a project developer enabling communities to buy and manage land for nature recovery. So in 2015, the Welsh Senate passed the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which essentially tricks all future legislation moving through that parliament into being positive for future generations and ecosystems. So given what's just been said about the tiny minority of all capital flows being nature positive, is there a regulatory mechanism that any of us can come up with that could essentially trick the 99% of nature negative capital flows into being nature positive?
I mean, I can answer the second part of the question around, so yeah, the $700 billion that currently degrade nature, most of that is subsidies paid for by the government. So there's no magic mechanism we need. We just need to think about what we subsidize and use it to subsidize public goods, as well as, meet the other policy goals that those subsidies are intended to achieve. Many of them are really badly targeted, to be honest. So to help the same people we really want to help, there are ways to do it more thoughtfully. I think subsidy reform is the easiest. Well, it's incredibly hard, but in relative terms, I think it's the part, because we should. I mean, everyone should be up in arms about waste of public money, right? We love that, and this should be just as much of an issue as any other wasteful public spending. It's not, I think, partly because there are individuals involved, human beings who have interests, and those interests are not necessarily unfair. It's really hard being a farmer in any country, and the fact that you get some money from the government to subsidize practices can keep you afloat in tough years. So it's not about taking money away from those people. It's about paying for outcomes that we actually care about collectively, as well as guaranteeing livelihood. So that would be my pitch for that.
Sure. So, I mean, finance will move if there's an opportunity. At the moment, there's just not an opportunity, really, unfortunately. And a lot of that, okay, not a lot, but there's, and so one of the blockers we see, and I'm speaking for the UK, is corporates, that they are not incentivized to move on nature. Like I talk about this all the time, but like they were incentivized to move on climate. And really, that's just net zero. That people now think climate is nature. We know it's not, it's interconnected, but that doesn't cover nature. So we have to get them to move, because then the minute they move, then there's finance can flow to help companies transition through those nature positive pathways if we have them, or if companies are moved to then buy offsets. At the moment in the UK, there's no incentive. We've got mainly voluntary markets. We've got 2 compliance markets, and that's it. And in the voluntary markets, companies are nervous, or so they say, about buying credits in carbon credit, nature-based carbon credits, so they don't move. So until we start to push on companies, and I don't know whether that's like a mass movement we need, or probably we just need to regulate it and force those disclosures, so we're almost shaming them into moving. I can't see how we get the money to flow, because where's the money flowing to? There's a company in the middle that needs the financing or is going to be buying credits if you're looking at markets.
Helen, to you, this question is, are you finding that some parts of the finance sector are adopting nature into their risk management faster than others?
No. I'm trying to think, like, no. I think that's it. I don't know, Steve, you got anything?
I mean, again, back to agriculture, right, where you rely directly on natural capital value to produce food and whatever other commodities. And you are seeing lenders, and certainly some of the lenders we've looked at in Brazil, they're absolutely looking at yields and change in yields as climate is changing, and practices that can help regenerate that. So many of the large banks are actually involved in, they don't call it regen ag, but it's very similar, partly because it's a risk management tool for their lending. These often very large loans to very large growers. So that's one area.
No, you're right. Like banks, probably on the ag side, they are. And to be fair, like when we look at the uptake of TNFD just in the UK and actually globally, it's financial institutions more than companies. Like financial institutions worry about it, but they don't know how to understand that risk, because unless their companies tell them where the risk is and start disclosing. So there is that gap. But you're completely right. On agriculture, there is more of a concern. And so they are looking at that. But again, unless you can figure out where the supply chain is, back to where are the strawberries, it's tough.
Yeah, I was just going to add into that, and actually some of your comments have spoken to what I was going to say. That I mean, those that are taking TNFD forward quicker, you would like to think would then lead to that. Certainly, there is quite a lot of difference on some issues around commodity policies, for example, within banks and the way they're managing that. Actually, we recently gained some really good traction with financial institutions in coming at it from a point of view of environmental crime, which then suddenly brings your compliance teams concern about financial crime, and then you get a completely different conversation with a financial institution about their exposure and the risks to them. And it's hopefully an entry point where we can open up then the conversation of, well, there are other risks here too that aren't necessarily about legality, but are about some of the things you were talking about, Helen, about exposure and undermining their own investments through the degradation of nature and so on. So I would say there is a spectrum, and there's certainly different when you talk about a local bank in pick any country around the world, it's going to be different to a multinational bank that's exposed to different regulatory environments as well. So there's a lot of diversity on readiness, knowledge, and approach.
So some of you might be interested in the emergence of biodiversity crediting or kind of payments for biodiversity results. With my global sort of nature-based developer hat on, I'm looking into it. I mean, the question should be coming out of the TNFD and other kind of disclosure mechanisms, and companies should then be encouraged to invest in biodiversity, and maybe credits are one of the ways to do that. But I mean, the reality and the answer to the question is there's no actual signal yet for that. There's absolutely no signals. Just to make the point, that doesn't mean we shouldn't obviously continue efforts to understand better ways of characterizing biodiversity, whether it's credits or units or tokens or whatever you want to call them. I think it's probably a good way to go. But making the case to a corporate about why they would buy that is a very, very tricky topic. And some people are saying, well, it should be inset into the supply chain, but as Helen's pointed out, if that company doesn't even know where it's sourcing some of its stuff, how are you going to convince them to invest in a forest that is the watershed of the farm that's growing the strawberries or whatever it might be? I mean, probably not a great example. So a long way to go on that, I would just say.
It's not even a question, but I wanted to echo what the first person just said. When it comes to indigenous people's involvement. And the entire time when we were having this discussion, well, when you talk about indigenous people, we're talking about their participation, forgetting that the land is theirs and they should be involved in every step of the project. And also just looking at the longevity of the project, considering that most projects go up to 30 years and whatnot, you also notice that. No, let me just go back to what the first speaker just said. He was talking about there not being governance structures with indigenous peoples and local communities, but we also understand that these indigenous people have always had their own way of managing their resources. So also just involving these people, and we understand that there is also lack of expertise among these indigenous people, so they might not understand, and that is where the interdisciplinary approach now comes in, where we involve environmental lawyers just to ensure that these indigenous people understand what these projects are about every step of the way. And this will help us address challenges around benefit sharing, where we've always had challenges around transparency of these projects. These will be greatly addressed, considering that they are the ones that are putting these restoration efforts in the first place, and not the project developers. Yeah, and also at the moment we are talking about, when you talk about involving indigenous people, most project developers just focus on the FPIC process. But even in the FPIC process, it's already flawed, because do the indigenous people, do the local communities really understand the project? Or is it just because we've noticed that these people are challenged socially, that they are poor to some extent, that you only mention the money aspect, that this is what you're going to get. So if I do not have resources for, let's say, building a school or taking my kids to school, and you tell me that, I will give you money for that, I would easily accept it. But do they understand the ecological aspect of it? Do they understand the social aspect of it? So just ensuring that these indigenous people understand every bit of the project before even the project itself starts running is essential. And also because the project is running long term, it is also very essential to involve young people, because you can't be making decisions of 20, 30 years without involving young people and only involving elders. They're not going to, experience the impacts of this project 10, 20, 30 years later, because probably they would have been long gone. So yeah, so having like social inclusion involving women, young people, the elders, everyone, and just ensuring that indigenous people really understand what these projects are.
So over there and here, afterwards, and no additional questions.
Thank you. I just wanted to pick up again on the conversation before about potential for legislation or acts, and I'm interested in the panel's thoughts on either the potential power or of new legislation or acts, or how it might shift corporates' assessment of risk if any country were to either follow in the steps of New Zealand by granting legal personhood to an element of nature, as was done with the River Wanganui, or sort of developing that concept of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act and, say, putting in something in place like the Wellbeing of Future Ecosystems Act.
See?
I think that concept is a really interesting one, particularly the way New Zealand's applied it. It is, in some ways, an extension of granting legal rights to Indigenous peoples and the peoples who steward the land. We're not doing a great job of that in the first place. So I've really struggled to see how we can do that effectively. I think in principle, I really massively support the idea. But I think we're struggling with granting legal personhood to persons right now who deserve it. And so it feels like an interesting policy experiment that we should follow, but there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in terms of people who can advocate for themselves if given the chance.
Hi, my name's Alex from WWF UK, and I'm going to stick on the topic of risk. And so if we think of financial decision making or decision making in non-financial corporates, regulation can influence behavior, but then there are the economic incentives that the profit motivated incentives, so to speak. So on this issue of risk, I just wanted to hear perspectives on whether you think that we can quantify risk enough in financial terms to motivate behavior. And I guess this question is a question of time horizons, right? So risks over what time frame? Yeah. Business cycles are rather short term when if you compare that to environmental rhythms and so forth. So yeah, that's my question. Can we get to a point where we can quantify risks enough, or we can think of impacts or dependencies as per the TNFD framework to influence or motivate businesses?
Helen, yes, over to you now, and then Ben, if you want to complement.
I hope so. At the moment, I know it's a silly answer, but so that piece of analysis that was done was at a very high level, it was a macro level, economic level. It wasn't at a portfolio level at all, and certainly not a company level, because we just can't get there yet until they actually start locating where everything is and then reporting on their own risk. How do you then you can build the scenario analysis around, is that going to move? Is it going to move anything? So I'm intrigued to hear what maybe Sid and Will say on this as well about this risk point. Some of the pushback we keep getting is enough with the risk. We want to hear about opportunity, and that's because even if you put the risk in front of the board, they're not interested at the moment unless they can see, oh my God, this is going to happen almost immediately. And by the way, that analysis we did, it could happen tomorrow, that acute risk, that shock that drops GDP to 6%. And in the case of a AMR pandemic, 12% drop. It was sort of done over the next decade. So it actually could happen now, and we're already losing money. But that still doesn't move people. And we even saw this in climate. I remember just the banks were like, well, it doesn't really affect us yet. And the insurers will say, well, we can just raise premiums. So it's sort of, at what point are we going to listen? And so what we're hearing at the moment is, can we start to switch the conversation to opportunity? And that will get our boards excited and our CEOs. So I hope that we'll get to that granularity of risk where people then will go, oh shit, now we'll do something. But it's going to be a while, I would think.
All risk is perceived risk. People sometimes talk about, oh, the perceived risk is really high, the real risk is low. Ex ante of something, you have no idea what the risk is, right? It's an assessment of risk. So every single assessment of risk is incorporates data, hopefully, but is ultimately a subjective assessment. And so all of it's perceived risk. And currently, even if the perceived risks, from nature degradation, for example, are relatively low, the other part is they're also not sufficiently differentiated. So if you think about nature as a systemic risk, just like climate, you say everything might be bad, then everyone suffers equally unless you realize that you're fundamentally more exposed than your competitors. Then it becomes a really important issue to fix, right? If not, then you say, cocoa prices will go through the roof, as they have over the last 3 years because of climate risk. Every buyer and trader of cocoa has suffered as a result. And very few people thought about that ahead of time and locked in supply. So that's where we are. But it hasn't killed the cocoa business, right? Because everyone's suffering. And so I think we'd have to have enough measurement. This is Helen's other soapbox speech is about measurement and metrics, which is really important because if you have that, then you can figure out how your individual supply chain might be exposed to specific risks that you might be able to mitigate.
I just wanted to respond to a couple of the earlier points actually, and appreciate the contribution from way up high in the sky up there, behind the lights. And I think it's just an important reminder that when we're talking about finance, we still need to be upholding all the integrity principles that we've talked about over the last few days around nature-based solutions. And I think there is, we're in the middle of a project right now, again, with Oxford, looking at that question of when you start to build a nature-based solution for a private investment, what risk does that pose to those integrity principles? And how do you manage that? Because you start to bring in a whole different set of considerations. And it connected for me to something that Valeria was saying about the need to adapt, what finance governance models normally look like to how indigenous peoples and other local communities might be organizing themselves, so that you actually think fresh about how this needs to be run to uphold that. So just some interesting food for thought for us all to have there. I don't know whether Valeria wants to come in on any of these. And then the question on, we were brought back to the policy point. I think we absolutely, there's a need to generate more incentives, more revenue sources for nature-based solutions to get scale, and a diversity of those, so that we don't rely purely on carbon for all the reasons we've talked about in the last few days. And there are so many examples around the world where that is happening. And Sid pointed out, subsidies has got to be like your kind of number one source, right? It's, if you can flip that around, you solve this whole finance gap that we talk about in the GBF. And we look at more recent things as developments in the US, where nature-based solutions are now able to be considered infrastructure investments for I think it was for disaster risk reduction. Suddenly that opens up a whole new, so these things absolutely have to be done, will be done, but we've got to keep pushing and being creative about how we work within what we've got as well, but not lose sight on those long-term changes that need to happen. Otherwise, we're not going to have the diversity and scale and be able to respond to whatever societal challenges is wanting to be addressed by the rights holders in question.
Thanks, Ben. I would like to have a question for Valeria, if anyone over there. Thank you.
So much. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you so much to the whole panel. I just wanted to follow on a bit from what Will was saying and hear from Valeria. What sort of support do organizations like Fondo Pedali need going forwards, for example, from people in this room? Yeah, thank you so much. I'll give some time for the translator to pass the question.
Let's go back then to the general comments. I am thinking a lot about all this conversation we've had and the questions that have been put forward. Of course, I believe we have to think about the problem, to think about the solutions, to bring the solutions. But as an indigenous person, we are sometimes very concerned with the process of discussion, which are very much based from a point of view which is based on economics. Here, we're discussing solutions-based, nature-based solutions, that is. And we're thinking about solutions which have to do with indigenous people from outside in, and never thought about a process of reflection of really enabling or getting to know the traditional knowledge of indigenous people, their contribution. Data in general show that in indigenous territories across the world are those who are better cared for in every single way. These are recognized data. But it seems that this is not enough for us to be able to change the perspective of and our vision and say, what is it that indigenous people do to keep their territories conserved, looked after from this data that is being shown? On the contrary, we always think that we need to improve, we need to bring something else in order to impose the models established by this society and then taken to the indigenous peoples from the point of view where indigenous people have to adapt. I would like to share my anguish in terms of participation in these processes of how far we are. We are very far from being able to learn in every single sense, exchanging knowledge, but we never give up. We have to carry on. But it's important that indigenous people and their cosmovision is inserted within this process, within this debate, from a real experience of the care of the lives within the territories of indigenous people. I am more reflecting on the debate we've just had, but all sorts of support Podali needs. I said something that first, this audience here that is reflecting about nature-based solutions is to support indigenous peoples' initiatives and what they already do, because what they already do, they do well, and the results that we see are reflected in the data. Preserved indigenous territories wherever you are in the world with biodiversity, water. This is really what I wanted to leave with you. Experiences like the Podali Fund, and there are other experiences across the world, that they are an opportunity to make partnerships with indigenous people, and that these partnerships can support initiatives in a number of ways. Why? Because you are working with an institution or with an indigenous organization led by indigenous people who know and are part and are at the core of this internal process, which is the unique knowledge of the indigenous and traditional people. With this, I conclude. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here with you.
Question here and another one there, and then we are going to wrap up.
Maybe a comment related to that. I just maybe talk a little bit about the case of Bolivia, just to support what is happening there, what we just talked about. Bolivia had a new constitution in 2009 where they declare, first of all, that you cannot trade with Mother Nature rights. So you cannot, they gave the Mother Nature, La Pachamama, all the rights. So you have, she had legal rights as Mother Nature, as Pachamama. And on the other side, they gave autonomy to several indigenous communities that wanted so. So they have complete autonomy to rule over themselves as they wanted. But that had two consequences. First of all, because of that you cannot trade with Pachamama rights, they closed completely and entirely the doors to selling carbon rights. So we are like years behind from neighbors as Brazil, Peru, and Ecuador that are trading carbon and are selling and working with developers on that a long time ago. And because of this economical crisis that we are having right now, they are now exploring on opening this these opportunities, and they're exploring that with the government. The government has defined 2 regions where that could be explored, so it's not yet open, but it's about to open. But in this process, a lot of developers came and started to offer that to the indigenous communities. And it's a little bit crazy. The Fundación Natura, where I work, they work with conservation with this indigenous community a long time ago, and they're completely confused right now because we are, like I said, 10 years behind without how does it work? How should we organize ourselves? Are we going, and they are receiving already different developers with different ideas, with different ways of implementing that, completely confused and have no idea about how to do that. And they have no idea who to trust. And at the same time, is the process with the government, no? So they are reorganizing their own salvaguards or reorganizing their own governance to see how it works. They're even fighting among themselves because some of them are receiving how the offers from one side and the others from the other side. And right now that the door is about to open, everyone is crazy. Like, how do we do this? How we organize ourselves? And this is a really interesting case to explore. And maybe it's really hard because, as Valeria said, it's a long process to decide how to arrange your own governance related to that. And people are knocking on the door and trying to push this door as fast as possible. And like, let's make it work and let's make it work fast. So right now is this confusion between developers, the government, the indigenous communities, and it's right now a chaos that people don't know where to start to find it. And it definitely something to consider from what they said about the whole organization of the community and the time needed for that. No, they have to be fast, but at the same time they need time. Thank you, just to share that.
Thank you. Over here.
Hi, my name is Pedro Moracosta. I've been in many guises related to this subject since the early 90s. I'm involved in carbon projects since 91, impact investment, project developer, etc., etc. Over all these years, I was a big believer in carbon markets and the power of mobilizing private capital to protect nature and also promote renewable energies, as it was the case during the Kyoto years. After all this time, eventually kind of nature-based solutions joined the carbon markets. I mean, it was completely out of Kyoto. It came back in the last 5 years. Finally, kind of carbon markets discovered trees. Amazing. Now, having said so, having believed in private capital and private flows, I wonder if we are too over-reliant on that. And there are many reasons for saying so. I mean, the first one is, if you look at the size of the voluntary carbon markets, last year I was there in the COP with a lot of former colleagues opening champagne bottles and saying, hey, we reached $2 billion the market this year. Guess what? $2 billion is smaller than the global markets for nail clippers. It's nothing, right? And as Sid mentioned, I mean, private flows to nature-based solutions, public flows to nature-based solutions are orders of magnitude higher. At the same time, we also have a lot of difficulties that I didn't have when I was financing renewable energy projects. When you bring nature-based solutions, which I always advocated for since and was really disappointed in Kyoto when it left it out, but land is emotive. Land has biodiversity, it has people, indigenous peoples, local communities, it competes for food and so on and so forth. So the difficulties are enormous, and they are also reflected in methodologies that exist there to quantify carbon flows, et cetera, et cetera. So at the same time, nature-based solutions are very much in the NDCs of most southern countries. So we need to deal with that. So it's one for the panel is, should we be thinking about having some sort of public-private partnerships in which the private sector support governmental policies to implement the NDCs and the NDCs' ambitions towards nature? I think perhaps we may have a winner there as opposed to the both sides working somewhat separately.
Would you like to comment? There's one. You're like taken by surprise.
I think it's a really interesting question and discussion. I don't think I have landed on what that is. I know I'll just share some of my own thinking on this. I personally see nature markets, carbon markets, as a way of getting money out the door now because it's needed. I don't personally, in an ideal world, we wouldn't need them because we would have made that transition to that economy that values and invests in nature, but that is a long arc. And so I think they give us the opportunity now. And there are problems with them, but I think that's where we are. I look at the UK because that's where I sit and that's where a lot of my work is. And it is interesting what the government has done. We've switched the farming subsidy regime to be one that pays farmers for sustainable farming. And they're trying to understand what the private sector is willing to pay for, and then what the public purse can come in and pick up what it's not willing to pay for. And they're really struggling with what that looks like. And some of that comes back to there's no incentive there's no push on companies at the moment. But if they could get that right, that could be an amazing model where public sector pays for what other things can't pick up, and then the private sector pays because the private sector should pay. Like, they're getting stuff for free, like they should be paying. So that's kind of where my thinking is at the moment, that yes, we absolutely need that model, but that's just my UK perspective.
Super quickly, Pedro, I think similar to the earlier question, it's like, if you think about regulations that can take private money and put them towards public goals, we have a system, it's called the tax system, right? That's exactly what it's meant to do. And so it's almost like we don't need to invent a new system of free money from private companies flowing to the government. We have it. That's an example of tax, and then the regulations that sit around. It's effectively, in a kind of economic sense, an environmental tax, right? Which is then paid into a pool of money that restores nature. We could do a lot more of that. I think it's a great idea, but it works. Carbon pricing works. I think nature pricing hopefully will, in this case, at least drive investment decisions to the places where it's least destructive and create money to do the good things that governments can do if they have the money.
Ben, very quickly, and then Joe.
I think I don't know if I understood your point in your question correctly, but it's led me onto a thought where, so in our push, I say our, collective push to companies to address their climate and nature impacts, we have this growth in net zero, nature positive target setting commitments, which, if done, with integrity, can be a good thing, but it does often lead to a company thinking about its problem through its own world and saying, well, okay, I need to level off my impact, rather than thinking, how do I contribute to the transition we need in society and the economy, which is a different mindset. And I think if we encourage companies to think more along those lines, then they're able to invest in or contribute in ways that, for example, support the land use transition that will enable the conditions for them to achieve their targets in 20, 30 years' time, where the transition is achieved and they can be sourcing from places that have reduced emissions, reduced deforestation, are on the path towards nature positive. I think that is something that we need to be quite mindful of in the way we engage with businesses, as one of the investors or sources of revenue potentially for these projects, of finding creative ways to reward and incentivize that response to investing in collective action, rather than just responding to their own impacts.
Yeah, it's a good question. And take your point about it being a very small flow at the moment, but you're right. If I could reflect from Tanzania, it's has an extremely important forest estate, as do many of the countries I'm sure you've worked in South America. The obvious thing for these kind of things, we have a cross-border carbon tax for the EU now, so that's going to change things already. But why not, for some of these countries, they have NDCs to meet, they have amazing forest estates. The obvious thing, as you say, is to, and as Sid points out, is to have a taxation regime that releases capital to people who are actually producing those emission reductions using the forest estate. Now, the government doesn't have to do all that work itself. Often it can't. The Tanzanian government, for example, doesn't have a gold digging machine. It just doesn't have one. So what it does is it licenses companies to come in and dig that gold up for them, and they take a royalty. Well, in the carbon world, let's just stick to carbon for now. But I accept it's only one revenue flow. We'd love to have others. Why not just have a regulated system for companies within Tanzania to pay for their emissions? The NDC could be met as part of that, and private companies could do the actual work, meaning private developers, as we've said, in equitable partnerships with communities who own those forests. It would be such a simple and elegant solution. So obviously I agree, that's the way to mobilize finance, more than relying, as you say, on some sort of global desire to have this beautiful market where everybody understands the product, has perfect price visibility. That's not happening yet. We all know that. Whereas internal tax systems could easily put a price on carbon and incentivize, emission reduction activities based on, well managed indigenous forest projects.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Joe. Back to you, Valeria. There is a question that we requested to finalize all the panel discussions here. And I'd love to hear from you what, in your opinion, are the actions most needed in the run-up to COP30. And then, I'm more skeptical about COP30 than many other of my colleagues in Brazil. But I would say that by then, we should have made some progress on climate finance, and the countries are expected to release new NDCs or climate goals. So what are your expectations and of indigenous leaders in Brazil in relation to what needs to happen up to there?
Very well. This is I believe that this is a tough question. I haven't followed this discussion personally, but internally, in the case of Brazil and the Brazilian Amazon and the discussions that the indigenous peoples are having, we need to think about what is going to be done until then, what will be delivered based on the commitments that were taken. We are ourselves in the process of assessing the commitments that were made in Glasgow. From this perspective that aims at recognizing the knowledge of the indigenous peoples and their contribution to the process of looking after the environment in general, and how initiatives that are given directly to indigenous peoples are going to take place. So we are following up and analyzing what's reaching us from these commitments to support us. And what would be the next commitments to take on? On our behalf, we are also preparing to decide what we're going to commit with, what we're going to carry on doing, and what we're going to bring to this debate as indigenous peoples' commitments, and how we're going to look after our territories, our land, because this has a direct impact on the climate change process that we're going through. On the other hand, though, we are also monitoring Brazil's commitments, Brazil as a state and as a government, to try and understand what effective actions are stemming from these commitments. The challenges are huge, and governments can have contradictions. And one of our friend panelists talked about the very complex context that we are living in Brazil. There is a lot of pressure in Brazil for indigenous land to be open for exploitation, for mining, or other initiatives, or even decrease the space of these territories, open them for agribusiness. So there is a lot going on internally that goes against the commitments that were made. So we're going to continue to monitor through our organizations, and I hope that the next commitments are actually made into a reality, and that they are not just on paper and actually become action on behalf of governments and us as a society as a whole. Thank you, and I hope I could contribute to this walk from the perspective of indigenous peoples. Thank you.
For sua participação. Many thanks. It was great to have you here with us, even if virtually. So now, very quickly, 1-2 actions per each of you for what needs to happen up to in the run-up to COP30, please.
I guess I'll just give a perspective from Tanzania, which maybe I'm not completely qualified to do, but that's where we're working. I think Tanzania's emissions profile is pretty straightforward. Over 70% is coming from land use change and forest loss. So, we've just touched on it there with a discussion about how the government could work with its tax regime and private sector and the communities to deliver the emission reductions from that sector. From my point of view, Tanzania is on a decent track. They have not yet built the capacity actually to do those sort of things, but I think now that there's recently passed regulatory framework in Tanzania, which will need some tweaking, but it has at least set a baseline for carbon emission sort of action, and we're talking about COP here, so that's essentially the focus. I think that there is an increasing understanding in some of these forest countries that they really can use these forest estates to attract investment and revenues that can either help them meet their NDCs and or just build their economies. So I think I can see it going that way out, but I can't give a reflection of the Tanzanian government's position, obviously.
I think there's a really strong ethical, moral, intrinsic, spiritual set of motivations for following through on commitments. We should use those. We should reflect on them. I'm glad tomorrow is a day to do that. That's really important. Ultimately, it's why people do really big, bold things. So we should keep that. And then on the other side, I think we should have policies reflect our values so they can shape markets if we really want private finance to flow at scale.
I think my hope for next year is that we'll have finally brought together climate and nature. It just feels like we're still talking, even today, like in different conversations about nature for climate versus nature more generally. So my hope is that because Brazil being where Brazil is and everything that's happening in Brazil, that will actually move that conversation forward, particularly on integrating the risk side as well.
It's a tough one to answer, isn't it? Which of my 10 things to mention? I think maybe one observation on this conversation, and it links back to something I said at the start, is that we've been talking a lot about private finance here, but we shouldn't forget, and I think this is part of the answer to the discussion we've had around how worldviews could come together in this space, and it's that some private finance isn't always going to be the right solution. It should be the kind of resources that's needed and wanted where the intervention is, should be that which we try and secure and not be kind of seeking that landing point for private finance in and of itself. So it's about diversity of finance and resources for the right intervention. But the great, I think to some of the discussions we've had today, the big thing that would be great to be seeing at Belém, given where it is, would be more multinational or institutional investors and banks having really strong deforestation-free policies for their portfolio. We heard from David Croft and others how that conversation with an investor changes the way a business operates, and I think that would be a great contribution to what we need to do in the Amazon.
I totally agree with that, and I think we should wrap up because after this session, we have final comments from Nick Maldas, who is over there, waiting for us to finalize this panel discussion. I would like to highlight that for me, it was a pleasure being here with you. all and seeing you so much engaged in this conversation, so many questions coming for us. So I think we have a very engaged conversation here, and I'd like also to say a big thank you to all of you here and the panelists. Thank you. Bye-bye.
So I'm Nicky Maras. I'm officially that guy, the cliche of the person that's between you and the drinks at this late stage in the day, made worse by Will, who said he was the last speaker and that he would then, it would all be over once he had finished talking and you could get your drinks. And then he capped my bad fortune with a ChatGPT joke that got enormous traction. So that's not good. I will try to keep things light, and I will take the 15-minute talk ahead and slice it, hopefully in 3, to be roughly 5 minutes. So please bear with me. I want to say a big thank you to the organizers, the incredible organizers of this wonderfully rich day and week, where we've all, I think, learned so much, but we've also felt so much, or at least I have. And I dropped my kids at school on Tuesday morning and rushed, because I live in Oxford, so I rushed late as usual down my usual route to work, crossed directly with a friend entering the physics department, literally like that, which is just next door, and he was laughing because he could see I was late and running. And I came around the corner to the Natural History Museum and saw 100 people facing towards me in an incredible moment of high ceremony and, for me, enormous shame. So it's very good news that the ceremonial spirit was welcoming to the late, like me. And yeah, I think for those who were there and for those who weren't, it was a thing of great beauty with swifts, Sam Lee said afterwards, swifts circling over his head as he sang. So, I found this transformation of home ground, Oxford, home for me, deeply moving. And the energy of that opening ceremony has been brought back into the room beautifully by so many speakers and by the film that Krika showed and by the exhibitions outside, and there'll be more tonight and over the next, well, certainly tomorrow. And of course, boosted by incredible Mindahi with his powerful opening this morning, for which, to him and so many others, I want to say a heartfelt thank you. And in this room and the corridors, we've been discussing familiar ideas. I mean, these are mostly our day jobs. We talk about these things. But it's been a powerful reminder to me of how much better the mental and physical spaces we inhabit and the conversations we have become with community and with ceremony. So, that said, indulge me, if you will, with my shorter time, with a brief recollection. So this has reminded me very much in my heart as well of the first deep experience I had of the Amazon, which was a floating symposium that I jointly organized in 2006 for 200 faith leaders, indigenous leaders, scientists, politicians, and practitioners locked together. That was the genius of these events. Everyone was locked together in a boat, or in this case, because we couldn't get a big enough boat on the Amazon, 11 boats. And then everyone would come on to the main one to be locked together during the day, going down the Amazon to understand the clear, growing, and even then we felt desperate crisis for forests and people. And the year before, some of you will remember who are, long followers of this study and this work and this mission. The year before had been 2005, was the year of epic drought. They called it a 100-year drought, except it came around again, I think in 2010. And then, of course, last year, 2023, you will all know, was a year of epic drought in the Amazon. And the ceremonial culmination of this incredible gathering was here at the Meeting of the Waters, where in another hospital pass I was asked to anchor a platform where the two rivers meet, a place of unimaginable power. The world's biggest river, the Amazon, and the world's third biggest river, the Rio Negro, join and combine. And we anchored a platform there and hoped it wouldn't float away, while diverse celebrants, each in their own tradition, blessed the waters and reaffirmed our common and, of course, our total collective dependence on water and, as we've been exploring today, on nature. So it didn't float away, which was good. So I was very moved and delighted to be reminded by the amazing Chris Park on Monday's water pilgrimage. And so not all of you will perhaps even know that this took place, because it's part of the cultural program of this conference. So for those that have seen the cultural program, it began with a water pilgrimage on Monday. And we learned there that Oxford owes its own story and all it's become to water as a place where two great rivers, at least by English standards, meet. And they're the Thames and the Isis, making the Thamesis, and now it's just the Thames, because that's part of the story, right? We've forgotten the origins of things. And a film was made, which you should all definitely watch. It was playing on the opening on the first day, but I'm not sure if it was played with full sound. But a film was made to accompany that journey, and lost my place. Yeah, so in that film, I think the protagonist is Oxford for once as a physical character, a physical protagonist, not an intellectual protagonist, which Oxford likes to sort of be or is in people's minds. So if we could go to the next slide, or maybe I can do that. So this is from the film, filmed by our friends Serafina and Morton, our friends. And this is has helped me. I mean, to me that that says Amazon as much as Oxford. And so one of the unexpected ideas which has crystallized for me during these brilliant days is definitely to try and see the Amazon in our Oxfords, because they are there. And I think by extension to see the Oxfords, the centers of learning, in all the places around the world that are infinitely rich, richer in traditional knowledge and the great libraries of life, which we also each have on our doorsteps. And I dug out from 2006, I have it on my shelf, the dossier for that event. I don't know if anyone here in the room was at that event, but anyway, there were lots of people there. And I look back at the opening speech of Patriarch Bartholomew, who convened the meeting, and he asked the question in his opening speech, is this a journey or is it a pilgrimage? And Chris Park the other day explained to us, or reminded us, or explained to us, because I'm not sure we all know, I didn't know, I'd probably been told 20 years ago, but that a pilgrimage, unlike travel, mere travel, always leads us to change, and therefore makes us better placed to drive change in the world. And that with the right mindset and heart set, that can be found either round the corner from home, like here in Oxford, or without even moving at all. So those were some of the gifts and thinkings and imaginings that came to me from this conference that I wanted to share. Now I will try and quickly do my job, which was partly to recap, but I think you definitely don't want to recap from me of the rich discussions that we've had. But I will say, I had organized my thoughts around 3 T's you know, someone sent up the doing everything in threes on the other day of the conference, quite rightly. But so here's my trio. So the first is the need for political triage. The first T is triage. And I think this is, you know, based on the knowledge hasn't changed. I mean, looking back at 2005, you know, we were talking about the same thing: the climate impact, nature dependence and resilience, human rights, the role of markets. I mean, all our knowledge there has sharpened. We could talk a lot more about that, but we certainly won't do that now. And then since then, I mean, that was you know, we didn't have forests even in the UNFCCC process. That process was beginning to sort of get traction in 2005. You know, since then, I think it's fair to say we have consensus, right? We saw there was consensus in Glasgow, COP26, with the Glasgow Agreement. You know, every country signed that agreement, signed that declaration on forest and land use ending and reversing deforestation by 2030. I mean, some you had to sort of take it with a pinch of salt, given their track record. But nevertheless, the political space was created, the political space of consensus. Since then, we've had the Paris, you know, since 2005, we've had the Paris Agreement, we've got net zero targets, we've got the global biodiversity framework now, the TNFD. For all of these things, you know, ending nature loss is a must-have. I mean, it's obvious, right? And one thing that and yet, as we've heard these days, we still haven't got the outcomes we say that we all want and need, and neither the actions nor the outcomes. So if I could just go briefly to the next slide, myself. I like talking to myself in the third person. I'm actually a massive narcissist. Anyway, look, I just wanted to we had a panel on uncertainty, which was I really enjoyed that panel. So thank you very much to everyone. But I bring this up. This was a meeting at COP26 called Raising the Roof. I bring it up because, you know, partly because it was organized by Krika, who just chaired the last panel. And it was a just wonderful act of creative political action by you, and bringing together and working together with these amazing group of leaders suffering under Bolsonaro's Brazil. But Juma Shipaya, who is there, said the phrase, and it really struck and stuck with me since that time. She said, "What is it you don't understand?" And then she repeated it, and it was tingling. What is it you don't understand? You know, what are you not getting here? I mean, it almost brings out the absurdity of our ongoing inaction. Anyway, there were lots of great insights from that uncertainty panel. I won't go through them now. But look, the main thing is that thankfully we have a wholly different political story and reality in Brazil, thanks in part to the efforts of these incredible people and so many others. And, you know, for this political triage, you know, we count on all of us and every country, but we also count on Brazil building out on its G20 presidency and in the run-up to COP30, which will obviously be such an important moment for tropical forests in particular. So it was rather thrilling to have Karina join, you know, from a G20 meeting in Manaus today. So that's, you know, hugely significant. It's also obviously hugely complex. Let's not get carried away, but, you know, it's really important. So there's hope there, I think. And hope in this vision of not a bioeconomy, but bioeconomies. I was really happy to hear this frame of export, you know, to the world of this thinking. The second T is transition, and we've heard a lot about, you know, transition and the need for transition from many people here, including just now on this great panel. So, you know, obviously we need real transition plans from companies, from the big companies, not meaningless commitments that we could write a few books about, but it would be very dull. And just now, you know, we mentioned deforestation policy. We did a study a few months ago on all of GFANZ, all of the Global Finance Alliance on Net Zero. We assessed at Global Canopy, where I work, my amazing colleagues assessed 800 meticulously, painstakingly, took forever, you know, incredibly tough work to manually assess 800 plus financial institutions who have said that they are getting towards net zero and whose co-chairs have said deforestation is part of the transition planning, has to come first. At the moment, 20% of them, 20% of those financial institutions have, anything at all on deforestation. So it's just not on the map, and and that's not signaling anyone out. That's most of the economy is represented by GFANs. And what we now need is a true science-based understanding of where new investment should land right across the economy, and the practical bioeconomies to build on it. So many people, I won't single them out, but many people have talked about that today. But also for positive finance to be tethered and made sense of alongside negative impacts and the new risks arising. And I'm just terrified by the disconnection of the positive finance and the negative finance that you can sort of see happening all the time, and as could lead us into a self-destructive spiral of not just greenwashing, but the illusion of progress. So, we need to make sure that the negative and the positive remain tethered together. That 6-7 trillion that has been quoted many times over these last few days, I'm delighted to hear that number put out there, of negative finance, is transitioned across to the pile called positive finance as much as humanly possible. And of course, we also need investment into additional sectors. Anyway, I'm getting carried away. So, and we have also heard these days that markets, one thing markets have in common with water, whatever the good intentions, and, for many, many people we work with, the good intentions are absolutely clear. For many, obviously, they're not. But markets always seek, like water, the fastest route to the exit, the fastest route to the prize. And that brings risks. And we've heard about, leakage, a fantastic presentation on the Cerrado and what's happening, progress in the Amazon, and the flip side. Obviously, it's a massive simplification. I don't want to oversimplify the brilliant speech given earlier, but one factor is, we see progress in one place and a spotlight in one place, and deforestation goes down, it goes up somewhere else, so the whack-a-mole syndrome. Anyway, Mercedes spoke brilliantly about, I think she put up a paper that had the phrase, wicked trade-offs. There are wicked trade-offs, the social, environmental, and commercial concerns for this critical ecosystem. So that's where we now need to do the incredibly hard work of just transition. And, it was hopeful. There was a question about the power of the agricultural lobby and the blocking of progress. And, I was heartened to hear Mercedes' view that she sees growing understanding among some of that lobby that these questions are linked to the very survival of their own industries. And, I didn't know the phrase, she used the phrase agro-suicide, something I've been trying to give a name to for years. So I was so pleased to hear the term well, not pleased is, maybe not exactly the emotion, but it's a helpful term because we are seeing agro-suicide, and, I think it was the 10% reduction in evapotranspiration in the Matopiba region where we're seeing so many impacts, and that will have knock-on effects on the very industries that are clearing the land. So it's good to see that penny beginning to drop. So all of that definitely leaves us, I think, and I will close with this, also desperately needing the final T, which is transformation. We need something new as well. We need them all, but we also, I think, need something new. And, since we know that there's nothing new under the sun, there is innovation and we need innovation. But perhaps we also need something old, a coming home to ourselves and to nature for its guidance and support. And I was struck by many things that Marata said earlier today. But one of those many brilliant things was a saying that she shared with us, that we must walk backwards into the future. And, tomorrow, a whole day, thankfully, I say a whole day as if, because it never gets featured, but we should be having days of an exploration of those questions by some really brilliant people. So, you know, tomorrow's, I think, will be a very exciting day. So one last thing. Chris Park, going back to that water pilgrimage, said that water, because we went around, you know, ancient sites of water in Oxford, and we stopped at a capped spring, a capped well, on the road called Walton Well Road, which I go through every day and never saw the capped well, the Walton Well. You know, it's kind of weird because it's right there. And he said that water, you know, flowing water that we've now capped, but when you have flowing water and we go to drink from flowing water, it makes us animals again. You know, we're at the watering hole again, like all our cousins and our great aunts, and surely also our future descendants, in all the branches of life, human and non-human, who share the need to go to the spring, to go to the watering hole. And then he said, then you enter the water, and in that different element, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm no Chris Park, but what I heard was that when you enter the water, in that different element, you know, perhaps we can reimagine ourselves and the world we need before we come out again and put on our clothes and put on our roles and take on our assumptions about what is possible and what is not possible once again. So, you know, that's my kind of bathhouse. I think we need a few of our leaders to take that journey with Chris Park. And of course, he builds out of all the indigenous traditions of the world that he studied. And so, you know, it brings us right back round to the traditional knowledge of the regions in which we work, which have been represented here over these days, and which I think we all now must also rely on. So, triage, transition, and transformation. And a final T is time, all at the same time, please. So that we can turn what Mercedes called, I thought very powerfully, the sacrifice zones into sacred zones, which is what they ought to be. So thank you for your indulgence and for a wonderful conference.